Hey everybody, last week I told you I was going to start doing some deep dive videos into vintage basses, and we're going to kick off this week with the Music Man Pre-Ernie Ball period. And predominantly at the moment we've got Stingrays on the table here, and this is because we've got so many Stingrays in stock right now from the Pre-Ernie Ball period. It's worth looking at all the changes, and we're going to start with things like finishes, bridges, preamps, pots, pickups and pickup cavities, all good deep dive stuff. And we're going to start on this end with a 1976 Music Man Stingray bass. Before we go through all the parts, it's worth remembering that there are crossover points and the occasional anomaly. I intend to give you plenty of detail, but for an even more forensic deep dive, I highly recommend checking out musicman.global. We're going to put a link to them below. So, the first year and the first few months, these basses were nicknamed the radio knob Stingrays because these knobs were like radio knobs, with these black plastic shafts and the silver tops. The first thing to look for on these early basses is the pickup cavity is routed out with these two channels. Now that was done to accommodate this first pickup type, which was called the long pole piece pickup, because the pole pieces are 1 inch long compared to the later iteration, which were 5/8 of an inch, beg your pardon. Now these sat nicely in the channels, allowing you to screw the pickup up and down to your required height. So the next thing to look at is the pots and the preamps. Now, Music Man were using CTS pots, and you know the CTS by the code 137, which is the manufacturer code. So all the pots will be dated 137, followed by 4 more digits, which were looked at in pairs. Now this example has pots dated to the 18th week of 76. So you got 137, 76 is the year, and 18 is the week. The next thing to look at is the preamp. The first versions were covered in black epoxy, and one notable feature of the very first version was this capacitor soldered to the pot. On subsequent versions, this was on the circuit board underneath the epoxy. It's worth noting the next version had 3 different minor changes, which you can check out on, as previously mentioned, musicman.global. In terms of dating the instrument, you've got certain points to look for, which we've looked at in the pots, but we can also look at the neck pocket, and the neck itself should have date stamps. Now this neck is dated November 4, 1976, and the body is dated October 12th, 1976. So it's worth noting that these dates on both body and neck are not always going to match exactly. They could be a month or 2 apart, could be slightly longer, 3 or 4, maybe even 6 months apart. I'm sure there are examples out there with even longer dates that are original from the factory, but generally speaking, and the examples I've seen have been within a few months of each other, and often within a month or 2. So these date stamps are present on both body and neck from the start at 76 right through till about 82, at which point it became very inconsistent. The stamping process would sometimes happen, and sometimes you'd see bodies and necks without any dates at all. You'd also see examples with pencil written dates. So any of these examples can be found, but as I say, 76 through to about 82, you should see some form of ink stamp. Now that's not to say it's completely legible, because being an ink stamp, it can be put on badly. It can be slightly smudged or very faint. But generally speaking, you're going to see some form of a date. When it comes to serial numbers, it's worth noting, whilst they give a general indication of the year, they're not going to be exact, which is why you need to look at pot codes, body dates, neck dates, things like that. They should have some semblance of order to them, but they're not always going to be exact. One way to check if the plate itself actually originated with the bass is to flip over the plate. And if you look at the markings, the paint is lifted from both areas onto the back. Now, this is quite an exaggerated example where quite a lot of paint has come off. So some examples won't have any paint on there at all, which can be hard to prove if the plate was originating to the body. But generally speaking, you will see some form of mirroring on the back of the plate. So on early versions of Music Man basses and guitars, you would find the serial number on the back plate. Now this would be from 76 through to the end of 78, where you'd start to see the serial number being applied to the bridge plate instead. We'll show you that example. So here we're looking at side by side two 77 Music Man Stingray basses. The interesting thing about 77, there's a transition from the long pole pieces we discussed to these shorter pole pieces. These were about 5/8 of an inch compared to 1 inch on these pickups here. Interestingly, there were still many bodies in the factory that were routed previously for these longer poles, and these bodies were used up until they were done. They wouldn't waste anything. So you'd find this transition from long pole piece to short pole piece, but you'd still see the routes in the cavity. If we look closely at this preamp, we'll notice this is the second version, which has all of the components inside the epoxy on the board. The previous example we showed you had the little capacitor which was soldered to the pot here. That no longer exists on the outside, it's on the inside. So we looked at the transition in 77 from long pole pieces to the shorter pole pieces, and we still had the body routing, even with the short pole pieces. That continued through 77 into 78, where you would still see occasionally in early 78 the body routing like this. But by mid-late 78, that body routing disappears, and here you have a new body route. So we just talked about this 1978 body, and we're going to go on to talk about the 79 body below it. Now, they're largely similar, no routing in the pickup cavities, but the differences are on the control plate. This base has the black epoxy, whereas the one we're going to discuss now has no cover on the preamp. It's completely exposed. The jack socket is also now a new jack socket that was introduced in late 79. This one disconnects the battery when you remove the lead. It's worth noting that the Sabre bass, being introduced in 79, always had the serial number on the bridge, never on the backplate. In addition, the preamp was never covered in epoxy. So we just talked about this late 1979 Stingray. We're now going to move into the 80s. One thing to quickly note, the change, 1979, you had this very dark red wind on the pickups. By 1980, you started to see this very, very light copper colour. So as we look at these two examples, this one is from 82, this one's from 83. Now this is another transition point, because the first half of 82, you still saw the 3-bolt neck plate. By the second half of 82, the 4-bolt neck appeared. The other things to look for are neck pockets, which we talked about in the previous section. This example has nothing written at all in the neck pocket, nor on the back of the neck. No writing anywhere, no stamps. This example from 83 has both an ink stamp of Feb 24, 83, but also that same date written in pen, looks like pen anyway, in the neck pocket, as well as the date of 17th of January 83, which could represent the neck, although the neck for this example also doesn't have anything written on it at all. So who knows what those, having 2 dates in there is for. When it comes to the preamps, this preamp is largely the same as the previous preamp, apart from some of the colours of the tantalum capacitors. The change comes with these large grey electrolytic capacitors on this final version from the Pre-Ernie Ball period. It's also worth noting that at the end of 82, we've talked about the changeover from 3-bolt to 4-bolt plates. The bodies were no longer strung through the body, and now we have a top-load bridge. We've looked at 76, 77, 8, 9, and now these two examples from the 80s. I hope these have given you an opportunity to see the changes, some of the differences. We also need to look now at finishes and how to really spot whether the finish is correct or not. So when verifying a finish, we've looked at how the paint came off the back of the neck plate on the other example we showed you. We also want to be looking at the cavities, neck pocket, pickup cavity, and the control cavity, as well as the screw holes. Starting with the neck pocket, you want to see a bare bit of wood in the center with paint around the edges. Now this is because the paint stick that they used, similar to how Fender would have done from 63 onwards, in Fenders you see a sort of gap where the finish is not present about there. With Music Man in this period, you see paint around the edge, bare wood in the middle, but you'd also see these circular markings here. Now this was because of the piece of metal, I presume, that was screwed to the body to paint it, had holes in it, and the paint would come through. Moving to the pickup cavity, we want to be seeing a consistency in the colour of the paint here to how it is on the rest of the body. In addition, the control cavity, again, you want to be seeing consistency in finish. You don't want to be seeing loads of different colours in there. Screw holes, again, these are important to look at because there should not be any paint in these holes, either in the body nor the neck pocket. Finally, under the guard, generally speaking, you really should be seeing the finish lighter here than outside the guard. So to recap, we've talked about preamps, pot codes, body routings, we've talked about pickups, and even date stamps and finishes. I hope this has been really helpful and informative. Maybe you're looking to buy a Pre-Ernie Ball bass in the near future, and this has been a valuable piece of information for you. Or maybe just like me, you're a massive bass nerd and wanted to see the insides of a Music Man. Either way, I hope it's been good for you, and I'll see you on the next video.